What these three papers have in common is that they address responsibility from the angle of thinking about the kinds of relationships that are formed through gaming. And in Aleena's case, her focus is on the relationships between the companies and those they employ, thinking about labor. She doesn't address it specifically in those terms, but thinking about what kind of relations do we want to have with employees of people doing the work of creating games. And then Maria and Alexandra and I will be talking more about relationships between gamers themselves. And then at the end, we're going to have some time for Q&A. Rachel Bergman is here with us, and she's going to be looking through your questions. So please go ahead and ask lots of questions, and Rachel will be bringing up the most popular ones for us to address in Q&A following. So without further ado, it is my great pleasure to hand over the microphone to Aleena Chia.
All right, folks, I hope you can see this. So big thanks to the organizers and to Nancy and Rachel for chairing this session. So I want to start my talk by bringing us back to 2005. So in 2005, legendary game designer Will Wright at the Game Developers Conference gave a demo of the game Spore, and it adapted user-generated content in procedurally generated ways. And this was really innovative for the time. He called this the future of content. And this talk was cited by Yannakakis and Togilius, who's also at this summit, who presented yesterday. And it was getting people really interested in PCG, or procedural content generation. And for the reason for this they cite is that many of the costly employees necessary in this process are in fact designers and artists instead of programmers. And if we could replace these artists and designers with algorithms, then we could make games faster and cheaper while preserving the quality. So PCG in game development refers to an algorithmic creation of game content. And here, algorithmic creation refers to rule-based computational procedures. And this could be things that are very simple, that include a few lines of code, or they could be much larger systems with networks of dependencies and complex data management. And the thing to note here is that PCG is not new, and it's really been a staple of a genre called roguelike games for decades now. And the content that's created could be anything from levels, maps, rules, and so on. But the key here is that you have limited or indirect user input. And this means that you set the parameters, you define the input, and then you press generate. And in the talks that in the data that I've analyzed, which are talks from GDC, some people talk about it as if it's a kind of they call it a magic button. The generate is a magic button. Okay, so what I'm interested in delving into today is not so much the how of PCG, but the why. And here, PCG is often framed as a solution to a labor problem. It's framed in terms of labor efficiencies, and this has been exacerbated over the decades, because of games as a service. It has been a model that has been increasingly taking over the industry. And this is something that relates not just to AAA or blockbuster games, but also increasingly to indie studios. So efficiency, though, is only one part of the story. So it's important to think about these continuities of automation. So on one hand, procedural content generation, user-generated content, right? These two forms of creating content in entertainment media, right? They do create variety, and they are scalable in many ways. But efficiency, like I said, is only one part of this equation. The other part, in games especially, has to do with experimentation. Remember that games are not just technologies, they are also artistic, right? And they are also a business. So the reason why Will Wright's talk inspired a generation of game devs during the time was not because PCG made things faster and cheaper. It was also because it made things possible, right? And making games kind of combines these three kinds and more of expertise. But the thing is, when we frame something like PCG as the future of content, as the future of creativity, as the future of work, this taps into a kind of automation anxiety, and it frames any kind of intervention that you make in terms of technology, right? When responsible gaming in this context really requires us to be considering both the artistic aspects, right? What makes a good game? The design aspects, as well as the management processes that go on in the development. Okay. So here's a little bit about my method. It's basically a qualitative analysis of around 50 talks with the keyword procedural generation. And this is from the Game Developers Conference Vault. And the speakers range from AAA to indie and also to academic speakers. And what really got me interested in this archive was that it featured speeches not just from tool builders, so tech artists or engineers, but it also featured tool users. And this ranged from custom tools, so tools that that were built for this game specifically in the studio, and also off-the-shelf commercial tools like Houdini, for example, or Unity. Technical artists were featured quite prominently, but we also heard from designers, from animators, and also from composers within these 50 talks that I analyzed. One of the limitations of this kind of research, looking at talks from the Game Developers Conference, is that they're mostly post-mortems. So this is a kind of genre that it operates within, or they are tutorials. And what this tends to do is that it frames these issues, or it frames PCG in terms of a problem and a solution. And this inevitably kind of edits out the messiness of game development. So here's what I'm going to talk about today. The main takeaway from my talk is really about this bifurcation of creative work, right? That when you automate something, that you start to think about there are certain tasks that become designated as manual labor, even though they're done online, they're done digitally, right? They're done by artists working with ostensibly digital tools. Right, but they're called manual labor. Once something becomes automatable, right, it becomes designated as manual and even mindless, as I'll show you from the quotes that I'll be featuring. And when you automate that, you make time for the artistic work. But the question that I want to ask here is, who decides what work has artistic value and what work should be automated, right? That's something that's quite, that's political, that's contentious, and that has ramifications across not only the games industry, but in creative industries more broadly. Right. The second sort of takeaway that I want you guys to have at the end of this talk is thinking about procedural tools. That tools, they're not just there to be used, and that they really transform the task, right? Especially in the case of automation. And they define the relationship between tool makers and tool users. They don't just make things more efficient. They do something to the task at hand. And then the third thing, is zooming out a little bit to think about automation. Gaming can tell us a lot of things about the processes of automation, because even in these talks, which are meant for a more or less, public industry audience, you have a sense of how these tool makers are thinking in intricate ways about how to create manual control for artists over these automated processes. Within the public sphere, when we think about algorithms, when we think about automated processes, oftentimes, it seems like a black box, right? But here we have an opportunity to think about how the users of these tools can have more control over it, and how manual control as a concept, as a framework, can be applied more broadly beyond this context. All right, so the first of my quotes. This is from GDC 2017, and it's by a technical artist from Side Effects. And Side Effects creates Houdini, which is a 3D procedural software engine. And this is within a kind of tutorial format. Okay, and here what this technical artist is saying, that there are some things that no one wants to do, and we heard this in yesterday's talks as well, in the ending keynote, that there's just some things that are designated as boring, that artists and designers themselves say, okay, it's boring, it's repetitive, and here this technical artist is saying that there are things like lining up these baseboards in environmental design within games, or adjusting the crown molding, and there's just so much of it in a game that has a lot of content. And that's the thing as well. Over the years, since the time of Will Wright's talk, games have gotten just bigger and bigger, right? There's just so much more content. These worlds are not infinite, but they give the impression that they are. Okay, they're open, a lot more open world games. And this technical artist is saying, artists can just shut off their brains. And this is a quote that I really love. Okay, or I think it's really telling of what's happening in this situation, is that this kind of work, boring and repetitive, is like shoveling assets through pipelines, and that really gives you a sense of the value of this kind of work within this industry. Okay, so this is another quote by two tools architects. So they're building the tools, and they talk about how they iterate on these custom procedural tools. And here what they're trying to say is that, instead of getting these artists to spend all this time, adjusting curves, it just isn't fun for them. Instead, if we could make that more efficient, right, then these artists could focus on creating, on crafting, focus on the fun of being able to be an artist, right? Instead of having all the fun stuff, so the actual design of these environments, in this case, it was outsourced to other people to do outside of the company instead of having their in-house artists do it. And they said that PCG allowed them to actually work on this fun stuff. Okay, so what I want to remind you guys is that, these automation anxieties, they go back much further than PCG, right? And they can be traced back to the assumptions of who is fully human. So in this case, right, when we start thinking about how automation is really enchanting these tasks, about making these tasks magically disappear, right, what happens is that the freedom that is ultimately created through automation, what it does is that it is erasing and in some ways denigrating the labor of people who have always done this dull, what Anatoskowski and Vora call the dull, dirty, repetitive, and uncreative work. Right? In our collective colonial histories, this has been done by marginalized people, racialized people, and they have always been seen as, Amrut and Irani mentioned, they have always been seen as less creative and more robotic. So the work here is about outsourced work. Outsourced labor has always been seen by people from the global south, has always been seen as less creative and more robotic, whereas some work you just can't outsource. It's just too creative. And, and race, class, and gender mapped very powerfully on that. That's something that we can't forget. We must keep in mind as we move forward thinking about responsible gaming. Okay, so this kind of work, this dull, dirty, repetitive work, it's seen as derivative, expendable, and in the case of gaming, it is seen as interchangeable with automatic processes. Okay? So Judy Wiseman encapsulates, in her beautiful summary of thinking about the future of work and automation across, a number of books in this genre, that this race towards the future of work in think tanks, in think pieces, what we have is not less work. It's not the leisure society that Keynes envisioned in the post-war era, but what we have are really worse jobs. And that's something that, that we should consider moving forward. So this is another quote from an engineer from EA, and it's in a tutorial format. And something that's really important about all these PCG processes and these and automation within game development or game development content is that there's always a little bit to do at the end of generation. So for this tool called the level of detail tool, right, this engineer is saying that they're not perfect. So artists have to come in at the end of this process of generation and hand author these tools or tweak them a little bit. Right, and here the work of Gray and Suri, who are both at Microsoft Research, is really informative. Right, they call this the paradox of automation's last mile, that there are always inevitable glitches in the automated processes, and this always creates temporary work for people, okay? And it generates these new tasks for people. So the question is, who's going to do this work? Right, somebody's got to do it, not the programmer, not the tool makers, but the artists. And these artists' works are now rendered mindless, mechanical, and even automatic. So another slide reminding us about diversity and inclusion in the games industry. We know many studies have showed us that that women, racialized people, minoritized people are underrepresented in game industries across the world. But the thing is that even within the industry itself, they are even more underrepresented in fields that are technical, such as programming, such as tools building, whereas, more of them end up in art and animation, and if not in community development. So when you start to think about this, not only the bifurcation of creative work, right, but the bifurcation of tool makers and tool users, right? You have to think about how they're mapped onto race, class, gender, and so on. So moving on to tools, right? The idea here is that these proc gen tools or procedural generation tools, they really powerfully shape the relationships between different stakeholders. And here I'm citing the work of Stefan Werner in a new book called Making Games. This is from the MIT Playful Thinking series. And here Werner is also saying that, that the value of certain kinds of work also, are powerfully defined by these tool makers, right? That beautiful quote that I cited earlier about shoveling assets through pipelines, that's something that's decided by the tool makers. They're using their tools to frame different kinds of work in different kinds of ways. The tool makers also define the level of control that artists have over procedural generation in the form of these kinds of parameterizing tuners, shaders, and so on. Okay, so I want to also cite this great work by Amanda Phillips and Mike Cook and their colleagues. Mike Cook was at yesterday's summit as well, and how PCG has, when you think about it within the frame of efficiency, especially in AAA companies, they've often been projected or in a kind of masculinist frame, right? That these tools are there to as passive things to just create more content. But instead, what these authors suggest is that there's another way to engage with procedural generation, that procedural generation in and of itself can be a tool for creative potential. And this harks back to my earlier slide, when it's not just efficiencies that are important in thinking about PCG, but also the experimentation aspects of it. So another thing to note about these tools is that there are huge interdependencies, within these tools. This is a talk by a technical director in 2018, and this is about automated testing. So he's saying that, that if you change something by hand somewhere, it's going to have repercussions throughout the world. Okay, so sometimes it's even better to adjust things within the automated system than to go in there and hand tweak or hand author different things. So really, there is this momentum of automation in the games industry that too much control, right? Too much manual control is sometimes very difficult to manage, right? Not only that, these engineers recommend that sometimes when you let go of control, things happen easier, and you should just let things happen, and then it starts to look beautiful because of all these interdependencies. So this is a beautiful quote: "We shape our tools, and then our tools shape us," by John Culkin, referring to Marshall McLuhan's work. And here, there is this sense that that these proc gen tools, right, not only do they make things more efficient, but they also try to make human behavior more machine-like. And here I'm quoting from the historian of science, Stephanie Dick, right, in her research on the history of AI. Artists are being trained to think like algorithms. They are being trained to parameterize, to modularize, and then to relinquish control. And also to understand their own work, not as creation, but as tweaking, as cleaning up after algorithms, cleaning up after generation. Okay, so these behaviors, we need to think about what PCG is doing in that they are actually selecting what is intelligent and what isn't, right? What can be replaced, what should be replaced, and what shouldn't. However, the game industry has also begun thinking about manual controls for automation, right? Those sliders, those tools, those knobs. Thinking about how artists can be put back in the driver's seat in some way, how artists can, be quote unquote from these talks empowered to do more, right? And here's a quote by Tanya Short, who is a indie game developer, and here's her reflecting on one of her games. So she says that that a given room that was procedurally generated within a level didn't have any idea what its purpose was. That really, it was just geometry that was connected together and painted with a texture. So I want us to zoom out a little bit more now to think about, what is the purpose of these procedurally generated worlds? And this is not an abstract question. It's really grounded in concrete practices and concrete decisions and rationales that are made by developers, all throughout the pipeline. This designer said that the feedback that she got from her players was that these levels, even though they were beautiful, they felt empty, and that they lacked a sense that things were really connected and had deep consequences. So this team went back to the drawing board. They rolled back the prop gen, right? And they decided to really prioritize the player experience, answering this question of what is the purpose of procedurally generated worlds. For this team, the purpose was the player experience. Okay, so the question for us to really think about moving forward is that if an algorithm doesn't know what a room is for, how can we let it define what creative tasks are worth and how they should be valued? And here the thing is that tool makers, they cannot just default to efficiency. They have to decide, what is the purpose of all this content? What is the purpose of these infinite worlds? And how can it add to meaningful play? But the thing is, they can't do it alone. They have to do it in connection with artists and designers. Okay, so coming up to the end of my talk, I just want to share a few more slides with you, zooming out, like I said, again, to this bigger picture. So there are quality of life improvements made through these tools. The pipeline, it is smoothed out. There's less kind of replication of work. There's less destruction of the work that's already been created. But these developers are saying that that even though things are more efficient, and you are kind of alleviating crunch, you're actually not making less content. You're making more content, and you still have to crunch. Okay, so if we can go back to that post-war vision of automation as leading to a leisure society or creating more free time instead of more work, right? And if we can even go back to Will Wright's 2005 talk about how content doesn't just have to be expansive, right? But it has to be meaningful to users. The reason why Spore was so powerful was because UGC meant something to people. And if you combine that with PCG, right, that creates meaningful experiences when people are able to work on something they created and then share it with their friends. Okay? And if we can consider how automation could make less content even more fulfilling. And before you throw your hands up and say, the arc of capitalism always bends towards growth, consider this. Consider that that creative industries are already thinking about this question of sustainability. In this article by Jennifer Whitson and her colleagues called The Missing Producer, they interviewed 60 indie devs. And instead of growth, these devs were interested in creative and collective processes, in just keeping it going, in just working together as a team, keeping the team together and sharing their work with other people. And a shout out also to Nancy's work. This article cites Nancy's work on relational labor to show how BizDev, that the indie studios need to do actually impedes this goal of sustainability. So it's never an easy answer, but we have to engage with the different aspects of what sustainability means, about what meaningful content means, not only to developers, but also to players. So last slide, biggest opportunity. Here, I think that, that just the very fact that that developers or tool makers are thinking about how these automation tools can be sort of, can be made more, manual control can be created for these different creative workers. I think that's a huge opportunity, that there is opportunity within, the creation of tools to sort of make sure that we are on the right path for game developers going forward. The biggest challenge, though, I think, is thinking about STEAM expertise, right? To STEM plus art expertise. That instead of getting artists to think like algorithms, how can we get engineers to think more like artists? Okay, I think that's something that that is much harder. Right, and if we go back to Turkle and Papert's work from 1990, right, and they discussed epistemological pluralism. Even then, when they studied like coders, so students of coding, they found that there were really different styles of learning. Whereas some styles were more logical, structured, hierarchical ways of thinking, those dominated. Right, people who, the epistemological ways of thinking about code that involves more tinkering and more experimentation. Okay? And I think this continues even today, even when we start thinking about STEAM instead of STEM. So that's it for me. I'm so happy to be discussing this more and to hear more from the panelists. And I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Aleena. All right. It's interesting. Aleena is talking about the work of producing games. I'm thinking about the role of games amongst workers who are not necessarily, but maybe working in game industries, and thinking specifically about how gaming plays a role in social capital. And let me tell you a bit about why I'm thinking about this at all. You may or may not know that Microsoft has been leading a large initiative on the future of remote work, trying to understand how work has changed during the pandemic. And this is part of that project. One of the things that came out when we started looking at how work is changing because of the pandemic is that people reported feeling extremely socially isolated. So in one study that was done last spring, people described themselves as isolated, lonely, and disconnected when asked for one word that described their current experience. This is the words that came up the most often. This has really damaging consequences for individuals who may feel like they are losing access to information, access to support, access to opportunity. It also has implications for companies because employees' connections with one another reduce their likelihood of leaving their job, increases knowledge flow in the organization, can increase innovation. So social capital, super important for individuals and also super important for companies, super at risk during pandemic when so many of us have moved to remote work from home. At the same time, I was hearing, we're thinking like April last year, if you can remember back that far, hearing a lot of people talk about, oh, I'm so alone, oh, I'm so cut off, oh, I miss my colleagues. I was also starting to hear a whole lot about, oh, I've been playing games with my colleagues, or hearing a lot about Animal Crossing. My own colleagues all got into Animal Crossing, and suddenly it was nonstop discussion about turnips, amongst our other things. So I got quite curious about this question, what's happening in gaming? And so I started looking around, and I couldn't actually find much of anything that spoke to what happens when people who work together play games together, and how might that affect social capital, and how might people feel like that affects social capital. So what I want to tell you about in my quick time here is a couple of surveys I ran, trying to get a sense for how common it is to use gaming for coworkers to connect with one another, get a bit of a feel for who games with whom, and also get a sense of how people who are gaming with their coworkers think that it affects their access to social capital at work, their productivity, and their job satisfaction. So the first project I want to talk about very briefly was a survey of American knowledge workers, where about 850 demographically diverse office workers in the United States were asked to report more generally on socially supportive interactions, both over the last month and also the most recent supportive interaction they had had with a coworker. And the point here of looking at supportive interactions is that when we think about social capital as access to resources, that's a form of support, right? So if somebody is offering support to somebody, they are giving them social capital. And if they're receiving support, they're being given social capital. So support and social capital really go together. Support speaks to the actual practices people do to exchange social capital. So folks filling out this survey got a list of kinds of social support that they may or may not have done in the last month or the most recent interaction. And one of those was, in the case of over the last month, organizing an online game, and in the most recent, it was played an online game with coworkers. And what we found is that it is not just anecdotes. It's not just the random person going, oh yeah, I'm Animal Crossing with my colleagues. We found, again, this is not people who were elicited in any way because of interest in games. These were people who were elicited because they work in offices and they're American. 13% of them said they had organized an online game with coworkers in the last month, and 8% said that their most recent supportive interaction included communication in an online game. So there's clearly something really happening here where games are serving as an important space in which supportive interaction is happening. So second study, we looked at the Xbox console gamers and asked, many thanks to Gabe for supporting this project. We asked if if you sometimes game with people you work with, if you logged onto the console, this would show up as a message from Xbox. If you sometimes game with people you also work with, please help us by completing a survey. It'll take about 10 minutes. We sent this out to English language accounts of people who were 25 and up, and we stopped when we had about 10,000 responses. There were more, but diminishing returns. What we found is that gamers do feel that gaming with coworkers helps them to build social capital at work. We measured this with 4 items that are here. Does gaming with coworkers help me strengthen existing ties with coworkers I already knew, build new relationships with coworkers I hadn't met or didn't know, feel like I belong to a community at work, or feel less isolated at work? These 4 correlated very tightly with one another, so we reduced it to a single measure, and the mean on that was 3.74 on a 1-5 scale. So above the mean. People agree that gaming helps them with these things. This is especially true of people who said that they were gaming with their coworkers more after March 2020. So we use that as a way of assessing, are you turning to games as a way of dealing with the pandemic? And indeed, those who were said that it boosted their social capital more than those who said they were gaming the same amount or less. Furthermore, this experience of building social capital in games supports their work. People who say that gaming helps them to build social capital are the ones who are more likely to say that gaming helps make them more productive in their work and improves their job satisfaction. This is especially true of people who talk about work in games, which everybody who games with coworkers does. Importantly, the quality of the game experience matters. So we measured this with a 2-item scale, the extent to which gaming with coworkers is satisfying or unpleasant. Again, 1 to 5, again, nicely correlated. What we found was that the better the quality of gaming is reported to be, the higher the estimates of how it affects social capital, productivity, and job satisfaction. And that even amongst those who felt that their social capital was helped by gamings, and that social capital built in games helped productivity and satisfaction, that was even more true when they had positive gaming experiences. So quality really makes a difference. But there are some double edges here. It's not a universal good. I don't want you to leave this by going, okay, that's great. Let's just set up online games for everybody at work and all problems will be solved, will be connected. People who said that they were gaming because they were expected to reported lower quality gaming experiences. People who were gaming across hierarchy, so particularly people who were gaming with supervisors or people they supervised, generally had poorer experiences than people who were gaming with those at the same career stage as themselves. And there are also some issues of exclusion and inclusion, because we did find that gamers were usually playing with people they were already friends with outside of work, people who, like I said, were at the same rank in their organization, and asked to very generally, in comparison to other people at work, would you say these people are more like you or less like you? In general, they rated the people they gamed with as more similar to themselves. Not dramatically, but just a little bit, but a statistically significant little bit. So there is the possibility of in-groups getting even more in-grouped here. So in closing, I would say the biggest opportunity here is that gaming, which we tend to think of as fun, as pleasurable, as leisure in contrast to work, is in fact playing a really important role in fostering social connection at work, with implications for productivity, for satisfaction, for personal and for organizational well-being. So my question is, that's a tremendous power that gaming has. These are extremely important outcomes for people and for work environments, and hence for all of culture. If we think about that as one of the jobs that gaming does, is to help coworkers connect and generate social capital and reduce their social isolation, how can that be responsibly nurtured? It's an extraordinary opportunity. It's a whole, to my mind, it's a whole frontier that we've only just begun to see. And we have to be very responsible about it, but it's an incredible opportunity. The biggest challenge, though, is the flip side, which is if you think of going and gaming with your coworkers as kind of like going out for a drink after work, you see right away, we know that going out for a drink after work is an exclusionary practice. It's lots of fun for those who go. It is not so good for those who have kids and can't take that time. It's not good for anybody who's alcoholic. It's not necessarily good for people who are more likely to get hit on by people who have had drinks, and so on. So that's a practice that's been great for generating social capital, but it's also one that's really problematic. And we want to think about how we can nurture games as a space for colleagues to come together and have fun together and be better workers and happier workers. And at the same time, we want to make sure that that isn't something that, as that happens, in-groups are getting even tighter with each other, and those who are not in the in-groups are getting pushed even further away. There's definitely a potential of exacerbating inequities that already exist. So I will leave it at that, and I will be really happy to address questions as we move on. And right now I'm going to hand it over to Alexandra Olteanu and Maria Antoniak to tell us about their work in gaming. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you, Nancy, and hi, everyone. I'm Alexandra.
And I'm Maria. Nice to see you all.
So we are both very happy to be here, and so we've seen from Nancy's talk that gaming can be really a great way to interact and maintain social ties with your co-workers. But online gaming provides an accessible platform for people from different places to bond over a common virtual experience more broadly. And to give you a even broader sense of the many ways gamers cultivate relationships with others, in this brief talk, we will report a few findings from a collaboration between the research group on fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics at Microsoft Research and Xbox. And people play games from many reasons, as we've seen in the two earlier talks today, but social connection is a common motivator. And there is a rich literature showing that people often turn to online gaming to find friends, to foster existing friendships and relieve stress, in addition to many other reasons. And prior work also shows that acts of self-disclosure can help create and develop social bonds with other people. However, self-disclosure requires healthy and inclusive gaming communities where gamers can feel comfortable sharing their emotions, experiences, and opinions. But what do we mean by self-disclosure, right? In simple terms, we mean the process through which we make ourselves known to others, including the decision to share with others our personal opinions, our beliefs and values, what we feel and think, our personal stories and histories, as well as various aspects of our identities. And drawing from this insight that self-disclosure can help foster healthy communities, our work is motivated by a simple question: when do gamers feel comfortable with sharing personal stories, opinions, and emotions?
To answer this question, we wanted to examine gamers' experiences and perceptions around self-disclosure. We first ran a large survey where we asked gamers about their in-game experiences and attitudes towards trust and self-disclosure. This survey was answered by over 47,000 gamers on the Xbox platform. We also complemented this survey with an analysis of a range of public gamer forums, where perceptions of games are often formed and shared. Through these two study components, we can contrast more contextually situated insights about in-game perceptions of gaming communities with out-of-game activity on fan forums. In the survey, in order to understand when gamers feel more comfortable sharing stories, opinions, or emotions with others, we first asked about their general propensity to trust, as different people can have different baseline propensities independent of the setting. We also asked them about their experience with a selected game and the corresponding gaming community. Finally, we asked whether they feel comfortable sharing emotions, feelings, and thoughts with other gamers in that community, and their overall perceptions of other gamers in the community. We complemented the survey with an analysis of fan forums on Reddit. This analysis focused on linguistic proxies for self-disclosure, including the use of first-person singular pronouns as a proxy for general self-disclosure, sentiment analysis as a proxy for people's propensity to share emotions, and explicit mentions of friendships and other relationships. We also use these proxies to juxtapose gaming subreddits with communities known from prior work for high or low levels of self-disclosure, such as communities about relationship advice and communities about academic questions. In the survey, we asked gamers about their comfort with 3 different dimensions of self-disclosure: their comfort with sharing emotions, opinions, and aspects of their identity. In these plots, the orange bars represent the % of respondents who disagreed or strongly disagreed with the statement, "I'm comfortable sharing my emotions, opinions, identity in this gaming community," while the green bars represent the % of respondents who agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. Overall, we found that more gamers report comfort with sharing opinions than they report feeling comfortable sharing aspects of their identities, and even fewer reported comfort with sharing their emotions. We also find that gamers who play online more often and gamers who play to socialize are more likely to report being comfortable with self-disclosure. A possible interpretation for this is that gamers that implicitly or explicitly choose games and settings that support more social interaction are more comfortable with sharing their emotions. We observe similar patterns for the other aspects of self-disclosure, how comfortable gamers feel with sharing thoughts and opinions or sharing aspects of their identities. We also observed that gamers who selected more collaborative games like sandbox and role-playing games more often reported comfort with self-disclosure, and this held true across the different dimensions of self-disclosure, suggesting differences between genres and multiplayer styles. These results were corroborated by patterns observed on fan forums on Reddit, where we looked at a larger set of communities and genres. Here, we examine the use of first-person singular pronouns as a proxy for people talking about and thus sharing about themselves, as illustrated in these paraphrased quotes. For example, "I feel that I should stop considering that my opinion has not changed after the last games. I know that I may get some hate for saying I don't think it's any better, but that is how I feel." In these plots, the y-axis represents the game genres, where each genre represents a group of 4 gaming communities. The x-axis represents the proxy score, in this case, the rate of first-person singular pronouns. Boxes show the distribution of the scores across the communities. Corroborating the survey results, we similarly found higher first-person singular pronoun rates for communities dedicated to collaborative games and genres, and thus more apparent comfort with self-disclosure, than we found in communities dedicated to competitive games and genres. Friendship is also an important topic in some of these subreddits, with rates higher than in high self-disclosure health support subreddits, but not quite reaching the levels of relationship advice subreddits. When we examined mentions of friendships on the gaming subreddits, we similarly estimated higher rates of self-disclosures for collaborative games and genres. The main difference we observe between the survey and the forum analysis is that when it comes to emotional self-disclosure, the expected genre ranking is reversed. In the survey, more gamers self-reported comfort with sharing emotions in collaborative genres, but in forums, we observe more emotional disclosure in competitive genres like shooter and survival. We speculate that this could be caused by a difference in how we interpret emotional self-disclosure and how gamers understand emotional disclosure. For example, gamers might not construe various expressions of negative emotions as sharing emotions. However, negative emotions are also emotions, and we would also consider disclosing them as self-disclosure. At the end of our survey, we also asked gamers to share with us any additional thoughts, and we received about 8,000 rich text responses. We hand-coded these, and here we highlight the most frequent themes related to our study. Gamers had strong opinions about different communities and frequently highlighted differences and similarities between different games. For example, all answers change depending on the game and community. Most answers would be completely opposite for some other game title. Game design also came up frequently, often framed as constraints that encourage or discourage certain types of behaviors and interactions. For example, in my opinion, you can trust people, but the way the developers design games changes people. Language norms, especially trash talking, and its both positive and negative role in gaming communities was frequently brought up. For example, in most competitive games, there will be trash talking, but that's the competitive nature of games, and they wouldn't be the same without it. As we found in fan forums, friendships are really important to gamers, and they often mentioned social bonds and topics related to community building. For example, I attended the wedding of my gamer friend, even though we'd never met before in real life. I went to support my gamer family, who I've known for years. Finally, some gamers also discussed responsibility, often framing it as a personal duty and describing trust as something kind of like quid pro quo. Many gamers seek games for enjoyment. Responsibility falls upon all online gamers to provide a supportive community for each other to thrive. To dig deeper into the role of social bonds in games, we also explored friendship mentions on fan forums in greater detail. We find that most friendship mentions occur in posts asking about how to resolve technical issues and playing with the poster's friends. For example, my friend is playing on Xbox and I'm playing on Steam. Is there a way for us to play together? Do we need to pay extra? Friends are also often mentioned as witnesses of issues or events discussed in the post. It's as if the poster is appealing to their friends for credibility. For example, I've seen people cheat. I know they deny that it happens, but my friends have seen it too. I was playing with my friend last week when something happened. Friends are also protagonists in stories of in-game adventures, with the poster bragging about exploits and recounting tales to the community. For example, my friend and I were playing together and working on building a base when I noticed other people nearby. I had an idea. Many posts emphasize that playing with friends is important to the poster. It's just not as fun if I can't play with my friends. I created a Discord so we can chat together and coordinate outside of the game. And finally, friends are often mentioned because the poster plays the game recommended by friends. For example, my friends have been trying to get me to play a game for a long time, and when it went on sale last week, I finally decided to try it out. These emphasize that for many gamers, social interaction is a critical part of online gaming, shaping which games they choose to play and how they choose to play them. To sum up, based on both the in-game survey and the analysis of fan forums, we learned that more gamers were comfortable with self-disclosures in collaborative genres. Of the 3 dimensions of self-disclosure we measured, our survey respondents reported less comfort with sharing emotions. Although some gamers discussed trash talking and other emotional reactions in the open response question, they rarely connected these negative emotions to self-disclosure, indicating a possible resistance to or misunderstanding of self-disclosure, despite seeing the value of social connection. Across both the survey and the fan forums, we found that gamers place high value on social bonds, and they have many ideas and insights about how game design can foster strong communities. If there's one thing to remember, it is that despite the high volume of noise on social media, Listening with empathy to gamers can help identify and amplify stories that are important and that can improve the gaming experience for everyone. Many Xbox gamers had a kind and positive reaction to our survey. Gamers emphasized the power of social connection, especially during the pandemic, thanking us for providing these opportunities for finding community and building friendships. Gamers recognize the need for this kind of work, telling us that they have been looking for a survey like this for a while, and that they want more surveys like these, as it makes players and people in general feel appreciated. All quotations from our survey respondents. This study wouldn't have been possible without our many wonderful collaborators from Microsoft Research and Xbox, and the many, many gamers who took time to answer our survey. We're deeply grateful to the survey respondents for their time and trust, and we hope we've given them a voice today. Finally, reflecting on this work, we believe that there's still much to do in understanding cross-platform, cross-genre, and cross-game variations in how gamers interact with each other. Today, we've provided two complementary views, the survey and the forum analysis, but many other views are necessary. This study is one step, but these kinds of comparative studies are rare and difficult. At the same time, we have a huge opportunity to give gamers a voice. Gamers want these studies, and they supported our work with their time and ideas. We believe that designing games that foster safe and healthy connections can lead to magical moments in gaming. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so I think we're all here, and at this point, we're gonna hand it over to Rachel Bergman, who is gonna field your many questions.
Yeah, I first want to thank all the speakers for really, really interesting talks, and thank you for the audience for contributing so many interesting questions. If you want to keep submitting those, especially questions that might address all three, keep them coming. I'll start off with, it's a question for Aleena, and I'm going to amend it just because I think that it really touches on some of the other themes. So the comment says, thank you for such a thought-provoking talk. You've clarified some very layered and complex problems. A lot of it connects to mismatches between tool creators and tool users. What are some trends you've seen in tool creation? How often are these tools co-created with tool users at the quote unquote bottom of the hierarchy? So I'd like to start with Aleena, but I'd also be curious to hear from the other panelists how you would talk about designing for social connection in game development. So go ahead, Aleena.
Thank you, Rachel. So, yeah, I mean, definitely. So out of the talks that I've analyzed, a minority of them do acknowledge that, you know, that it's important to have these manual controls. But they are in AAA companies, and they talk about how, you know, like you can create more, for example, you know, sliders for getting non-technical artists to think about, you know, about processing their work in more tangible ways. So they talk about how to create visible hooks for artists so that they can manipulate these different PCG processes in ways that, you know, that make sense for them and that speaks to their expertise. I hope to see more of it. It happens only in a few talks that I've analyzed, but I think it's important because the talks that I have analyzed that have done this, they talk about how empowering the artists really makes the product better. So it's not just, you know, art for art's sake. You know, like I said, it's, you know, games are a combination of like business practices, artistic processes, as well as engineering. So putting these things together, I think is important. And I think you know, in the indie level as well. So indie developers, because their teams are so much smaller, the co-founders or the people who are there, they need to do so many things. That, you know, the division of labor is a lot less fine-grained. So someone who started out as a programmer is now doing, you know, design, is now doing, you know, art creation, is now also doing biz dev. So I think when AAA people go into indie or the other way around, I think that this is actually a very generative kind of movement within the industry.
Maria, Maria?
Yeah, I could respond to the second part of the question. I think from our survey, what we found is, so first, listen to gamers. The responses to our survey and the open text response, we received many positive reactions and also many passionate appeals and ideas for often in specifics of how they believe specific games should be designed, how it could help increase their comfort and trust in the game. And I think also on the topic of self-disclosure and building trust, giving people control and options for what information of theirs is disclosed, so that they can make the choice of what to disclose.
Yeah, that resonates in a way with Aleena's point to build for epistemological pluralism, of just making room for many different ways of interacting with and creating the games. I have a question here for Nancy. It says, related to the other edge, were there any findings on negative impacts of social capital related to judgment and biases? For example, wow, this person sure is gaming a lot, shouldn't they be working? I would imagine there are some workplaces where toxic judgment still runs amok.
That's a great question. And unfortunately, I don't have data from this study to answer it. I think it's a really important question because, and I think in a way, there's a bit of an opportunity here to reframe gaming in ways that can make it less stigmatizing as well. Because I don't think that stigma is appropriate. The shouldn't you be working stigma. People are quite capable of balancing multiple things, including fun and work. And I think what I hope this study shows is that sometimes work and playing games support one another rather than being in opposition to one another. So I don't have a really good answer for your excellent question. My dream is that this project might open doors for more people to ask questions like that and find out the evidence on how that's playing out, and also what might be done better. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. There's a question that just came in, which is a question for everyone. So I'd love to hear all four of you think about it. How would you contrast the study of games from other areas of cultural creation and consumption? I know Aleena gestured to that in her talk about how these findings might generalize to other cultural industries, but do each of you want to talk about that a little bit?
I'll say a few things. I think Aleena's work really helps clarify it, and I imagine that for many listeners, it's also quite clear, is that making a game takes a whole lot more people than making most other kinds of culture does. It's unless you're talking about like a little phone app game, you're talking about a major industrial process to create something. Whereas, for example, I've done a lot of work with musicians. Boy, you can cobble together a great album at home with 3 friends. It's a lot of people did it this last year, right? So it's a very different kind of cultural production in that regard. Yeah, there's obviously also some differences around who is the intended audience and who is assumed to be the potential audience, right? I don't know if there's a whole lot of people out there going, oh, who needs more games? 55-year-old women, let's go get them, right? I need more games. Whereas there's definitely music that's thinking about that population, or film, or other areas. So I think there's both a probably too narrow sense of for whom these things can be produced and a very broad sense of what it takes to produce them. Aleena, you want to speak to that, or for other folks?
Sure. Yeah, I can speak to the sort of translations between industries. So one of the things that really struck me in my analysis was about how some artists, that are working, so for example, composers, they are selling their art to be processed, especially so they're creating art to be processed through these PCG techniques. And how that can like procedurally iterate indefinitely on art that is sold. So I'm not a lawyer, but when I heard that, it made me stop in my tracks for a while and really think about what are the ramifications of any kind of content producer, right? When you sell the rights for for the creation, for the the procedural generation of your work, what does that then mean for not only for your competitors but also for yourself? But thankfully, in this case, the music was commissioned especially for a PCG program. So the toolmaker in this case worked directly with the composer to create something that was custom fit to the game. So in this case, it made sense, and I'm thinking about, like, this could apply to so many other creative industries, relating to music, but also to any kind of generated art, and increasingly to text, to journalism, and so on. So I know that the techniques are not perfect at the moment, but I think artists really need to come together and really think about what the future of creation is, because what is creation for, right? What is creation for? Is it for to share what we've created in order to keep on keeping on, like Jennifer Whitson and her colleagues mentioned, or is it something else entirely? And all of us, and this is the thing, all of us will have different answers to that question, right? But that's how a democracy works, is that we have to work together somehow.
Yeah, so I wanted to add, I don't think I have a good answer to this question, but what the question makes me think about is the type of stakeholders that we see in different industries, right? And the type of relationships that exist between those stakeholders, and who controls those relationships, right? What type of affordances we need. And I think that tends to bound even, right? How much we can translate from one industry to another. Games, right, play even this role of, right, social interaction, which is built in many of these multiplayer games, which does not or is not required necessarily for other industries. So that's something that this really makes me reflect on.
I'd throw in, I think, one other thing that is similar is that game and all the rest of the culture production industries are having to deal with these super organized audiences who are online having very, very loud opinions. Like yesterday, I was very entertained to see that Phil Spencer was trending on Twitter, and the reason was that people were analyzing what he had on the shelf behind him in his keynote at this event yesterday, which, I suspect he did that quite intentionally. Be that as it may, you have this phenomenon where you have these huge audiences, and they can be very supportive. They can really be rallied to get you through, to help you find the money, to demonstrate the enthusiasm that powers you through producing the materials, but it can also be toxic and abusive and horrible for those producing. So that kind of accountability and having to deal with an audience that was previously hidden in customer service complaints and whatnot is definitely new.
I really like this question. It makes me reflect on my own work. I also work in the digital humanities and cultural analytics. I've done a lot of work with books and book reviews. And so, yeah, it makes me reflect on what are the similarities and differences between these different cultural objects and how people interact with them, especially online. I agree with what Nancy was just saying about the fan audiences, and like in our study, considering these fan forums and organization by fans. The scale of the industry in gaming, I think, is a difference, maybe going to what Alexandra was saying around how the industry is organized. Games, of course, are an immersive social experience, so the types of questions that we have about how people engage with games are different from the questions we would have about how people engage with books or poetry. But there are also a lot of similarities around reviews that people write of books, of games, of music, how they organize their collections of games, books, music. For example, on Goodreads or Library Thing, other websites like this, you can tag the genre of the book that you're reviewing. Similarly, for games, you can think of different genres and tags people might apply and what recommendations they make or that we want to make to them. So similarities and differences, and it's an interesting question.
Thank you all for your responses. We've had a flood of more comments, so I'm just trying to sort through them quickly. There's a few that are speakers.
Got another 10 minutes.
Got a lot of time. Let's see, there's a few for Aleena. I'm trying to think of one that can kind of summarize these. Okay, so there's a couple trends in the questions for you, Aleena. One is, have you found that certain groups, artists, animators, programmers, etc., are less receptive to automation tools? If so, what could be the main reasons? And then another theme that's coming up in questions for you, Aleena, is basically who should they be talking to when designing tools?
Okay, so I can't really speak in much detail to which groups are more receptive to automation tools. But as we know, artists themselves, there's a range of technical expertise that they have. Some artists, they work on concept art. Some artists, are more technically driven. Some artists do a bit of coding. And I would think that along that spectrum, that would be where you would be looking at in terms of receptivity towards tools. There are sort of threads that I've pulled out, in my analysis about the comparison between Pcg and outsourcing. So some people compare, this automation process to, I don't want to train my outsourcer, right? And I've had to do that. So why should I train, my, this procedurally generated system? And there is friction there, and what I will say is that some tool makers, they will speak to this process in more or less, a condescending way, whereas some tool makers will speak about it, in terms of encouraging more cooperation between both. But generally, the sense, of tool makers, and especially in this GDC format, which is, like I said, problem solution oriented, is that PCG is a good thing. It depends on just how you deploy it, right? The idea here is that it's going to be good for everybody, and of course, that doesn't speak to more systemic issues about employment, about the nature of employment, but also the quantity of employment that's out there. Let's see the other thing. So, well, sorry, Rachel. What was the second question?
Oh, that's okay. There were some questions that said, who should we be talking to when we're designing tools?
I think you should talk to the people who are going to be using it. Definitely talk to team lead, but also talk to to the people that are working for them. Like Nancy said, and Alexandra said as well, that these are really complex processes, and within this pipeline, there's also a lot of turnover, within this pipeline throughout the process of making a game. So making sure that there is coordination, on sort of all those levels, I think is important. But also thinking about like the employment conditions of these people. So in what I've analyzed, there's like, oftentimes there are people who are not working permanently for the companies. Some of them are, are like not only outsourced, but also, they work temporarily, so they're not part-time, but they are contract workers, and there's a lot of lost expertise there when you have to turn that person over and then you have to start all over again, onboarding another employee. So I think the idea about PCG, right, was that once you have a system in place and then all these different not only procedurally generated systems, but all these different development systems can be integrated into it, then the knowledge gets, it gets retained within the systems themselves. And of course, coders, they always do their own documentation, right? And on one hand, I think that's useful. I don't think, employees should sort of withhold their technical expertise in a project of this scale. But I think, there are ways that that the workers, or the employees can work with each other to think about how to create leverage in the system. After all work organizations, even though we talk about coordination, there are also a lot of points of friction. That's what employment is. That's what production is.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question here for Maria. You mentioned that one survey response said how a game is designed can change people. Do you have any additional thoughts on this?
So going back to the survey results across the different multiplayer styles, so we broke them down into collaborative, cooperative, and competitive, and thinking about how the collaborative genres, more people reported comfort with self-disclosure in those settings. So thinking about what you could adopt from a more collaborative setting, and also what I mentioned before about giving people control over the information that is shared with other gamers, allowing them to manipulate that, change it, giving them options. I think that was a common theme in the survey responses, and there were, again, people had many ideas around the game design. Gamers had many ideas around game design. I think one thing that came up a lot was the matching of different players. So who you're going to play with and where they come from, their skill level. I think that was one specific example of a common theme in our survey responses.
Great. That relates to another question that I think others can contribute to as well. There's a question that asks, when thinking about building positive experiences, personal preferences vary from person to person. How do you think about building a solution that is also generalizable enough while also being personalized to an individual's sensitivity?
Would that any one of us had the answer to that question. I mean, that's the problem, right? That's the problem, is that people do have different preferences. And I try to think in terms of designing for the fact that people have different preferences and trying to give them ways to choose styles of play or styles of game or styles of other people that they're playing with that foster the kind of experience they want to have, rather than trying to create some kind of one size fits all and putting them all in it and figuring if it's good for these folks we tested it on, it'll be great for everybody. We got 2 more minutes, so I'm going to pass the baton on.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that even people's preferences change over time, right? And even going back to the previous question, I mean, prior literature has shown that people change the way in which they present information, what information they share, even across social media platforms. So this is not only specific to gaming, right? The affordances of a platform or the affordances, right, of the tools that you are using will impact the way in which you interact with others, how you express yourself, and so on and so forth.
Okay, I have one last question. If each of you want to think about it, Aleena, you're welcome to address that previous question if you want to. For all the panelists, what broad takeaways should game studios get from your research in regards to PCG and social bonding within gaming communities? You'll each have about 30 seconds to
Okay, yeah, okay. I guess I can start. Oh, sorry, Nancy, go ahead.
I'll just say you can't get out of the fact that you're designing environments in which people are building relationships, and you can't just put it on them, because the way the environment is designed will impact the kinds of relationships they're able to develop and who's able to participate in that. So you really have to take seriously the fact that you're designing relational environments and not just fun things to play. Not that there's anything wrong with fun things to play. That don't take just in that sense.
And we can all +1 that.
+1 to that, and listen to gamers. I think the survey response, like the positive response we had to our survey, that gamers want these kind of studies, they're eager to participate in them, they have ideas. So listen, and listen with empathy.
And I guess, my final, are we at time?
Nope, give a final thought.
Yeah, my final thought is, is to think about like, what kind of games do we want? Do we want quantity or do we want quality? So, PCG oftentimes, it's about, more, bigger. But, as we've seen, throughout the last few years in terms of the kind of games that really engage people, it's not necessarily the ones that, that are the largest.
All
Those
right.
were wonderful answers and all so concise. And thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aleena, especially for coming in from afar. And thank you, all of you. And thank you, everybody who joined us today, watching at home or wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thanks.